Welcome to Boring History, where the past whispers its darkest secrets in the quietest tones. Today, we uncover the shadowy legacy of Catherine de Medici, the queen who ruled France not with kindness, but with cunning, power, and whispers of poison. Behind the glittering French court, Catherine's name became tied to intrigue, superstition, and deadly plots. Catherine de Medici's story begins in Florence in 1519, a city known for its artistic brilliance, political maneuverings, and the legacy of one of the most powerful families in Europe, the Medici. Catherine was born into this world not as a beloved heiress, but as a fragile child whose life was shaped from the very beginning by loss and uncertainty. Her father, Lorenzo de Medici, Duke of Urbino, died when she was only a few weeks old, and her mother, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, died shortly afterward, leaving the infant orphaned before she could even know them. She was a Medici by blood, but her position was precarious because Florence was a city torn between the ambitions of noble families, the influence of the Pope, and the growing tides of European politics that were beginning to stretch far beyond the Italian peninsula. As a child, Catherine was caught in the power struggles of Florence, which made her both a pawn and a symbol. The Medici family had risen to wealth and prominence through banking, politics, and their close ties to the papacy, but not everyone in Florence welcomed their dominance. By the 1520s, Florence became a battleground between Republican forces and Medici supporters. Catherine, though just a child, became the subject of manipulation and danger because she embodied the continuation of Medici influence. During times of revolt, she was even held hostage by Florentine rebels, and the stories tell of how her young life hung in the balance, while factions decided whether to keep her alive or remove her as a threat to their cause. This early exposure to danger, insecurity, and shifting loyalty shaped the resilience and caution she would later display as queen. Her fortunes changed when her uncle, Pope Clement VI, a Medici himself, recognized the political potential of his niece. The papacy was not just a spiritual power, but a major political actor in Europe, and Clement sought to strengthen Medici influence through strategic alliances. Catherine, though not rich in her own right, carried the prestige of the Medici name, and marriage became the key to securing her future. Europe at the time was a chessboard of dynasties: the Habsburgs in Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, the Valois dynasty in France, and the Tudors in England were all maneuvering for dominance. By marrying Catherine into one of these houses, the Medici could gain both protection and influence. In 1533, at the age of 14, Catherine was married to Henry, Duke of Orleans, the second son of King Francis I of France. This union shocked many in France. Catherine, though noble, was not the kind of bride the French court expected for a prince. She brought no great dowry, no vast army, and no immediate political advantage compared to alliances with Spain or the Empire. Instead, what she brought was the ambition of the Medici and the will of the Pope, who had orchestrated the marriage as part of a broader political deal with Francis I. Many at the French court sneered at Catherine, dismissing her as a banker's daughter, a foreigner whose Italian origins carried suspicion and disdain. The French nobility viewed Italians with skepticism, often associating them with cunning, poison, and the shadowy arts of political intrigue. From her first days in France, Catherine was an outsider. She did not speak the language fluently, she had no allies among the powerful French aristocracy, and her position was made weaker because her husband Henry was not the heir apparent, but the younger son, unlikely at that time to ever become king. Catherine's survival at court required patience, intelligence, and a careful balance of humility and resilience. Despite these difficulties, Catherine was determined to make herself indispensable. She immersed herself in learning the ways of the French court, observing its politics, its rivalries, and the personalities that shaped it. Her sharp mind and natural adaptability allowed her to endure the cold reception she received. Yet one of her greatest challenges came from her marriage itself. Henry, her husband, showed little interest in her. He was reserved, introverted, and deeply attached to another woman, Diane de Poitiers, a widow nearly 20 years older than him, who became his lifelong mistress. Catherine, a teenage bride, found herself pushed aside, her position overshadowed by Diane's influence over her husband. For years, Catherine struggled with infertility, a condition that further threatened her position. In a court where producing heirs was the primary duty of a queen or princess, Catherine's inability to conceive made her vulnerable to whispers that she was barren, cursed, or unfit. Some at court even urged Henry to annul the marriage and replace her with a more fertile bride. Catherine turned to every possible solution, from prayers to folk remedies, in an effort to secure her place. Eventually, after nearly a decade of uncertainty, she bore her first child in 1544, proving her critics wrong. Over the course of her marriage, she would go on to have 10 children, cementing her importance to the French royal family. Her fortune shifted dramatically in 1536, when Henry's elder brother, Francis, Duke of Brittany, suddenly died of illness. This unexpected event made Henry the heir to the throne, and Catherine, once dismissed as a minor Italian bride, was now destined to become Queen of France. The transformation was dramatic. Those who had scorned her had to reconsider her role, though her outsider status and Italian background remained a source of suspicion. Catherine, however, knew that power came not from popularity, but from persistence, and she began to carve out her role with calculated patience. When Francis I died in 1547, Henry ascended the throne as Henry II, and Catherine officially became Queen of France. Yet her challenges did not end there. Henry's devotion to Diane de Poitiers continued, and Diane wielded enormous influence at court, often overshadowing Catherine's role as queen. Catherine learned to endure this humiliation, focusing instead on protecting her children's interests and securing her place in the political fabric of France. She supported Henry's policies, acted as a mediator when needed, and quietly built her knowledge of governance, finances, and the subtle workings of power. Her Italian heritage, once a mark against her, became a source of strength. Catherine brought with her not only Medici pride, but also a taste for Renaissance culture. She patronized artists, architects, and scholars, introducing Italian styles, innovations, and luxuries to the French court. The lavish banquets, elaborate entertainments, and architectural projects that flourished during her time as queen bore the stamp of her influence. While many accused her of extravagance, Catherine understood that spectacle was a form of power. By shaping the image of the French monarchy as grand and cultured, she reinforced its legitimacy at home and abroad. Yet beneath this cultural veneer, Catherine was always calculating, always aware of her precarious position. She had risen from an orphaned Italian girl with no wealth to the throne of France, but her survival was never guaranteed. Rival noble families, ambitious courtiers, and the ever-present tension between Catholics and Protestants in France created a dangerous environment where a single misstep could mean ruin. Catherine's early experiences in Florence had taught her that life, at the mercy of others, could be cut short without warning. And she carried this lesson with her into her queenship. Her rise to power was not the triumph of a beloved queen welcomed with open arms, but the survival of a woman who knew how to navigate suspicion, humiliation, and hostility. She played the long game, enduring slights, cultivating allies, and ensuring that her children would remain central to France's future. Catherine's story as an outsider who became queen is not one of sudden transformation but of gradual resilience. Built step by step through patience, intelligence, and an unyielding will to survive in a court that had once hoped to see her fail, the legends that surround Catherine de Medici are among the most enduring in the history of European monarchy, and none more so than the tales of her supposed poison cabinet and her reliance on astrologers. In her own lifetime, Catherine was feared and mistrusted, not only because she was an Italian queen ruling over France, but also because she seemed to carry with her the aura of mystery, superstition, and forbidden knowledge. Her enemies accused her of poisoning rivals, of consulting the stars before making decisions, and of keeping at her side a collection of bottles, powders, and hidden potions capable of killing silently and without trace. Whether these stories were fact, exaggeration, or invention, they became inseparable from her image, and even centuries later she is remembered as the Dark Queen, whose power was said to flow not only from politics, but from the shadows of alchemy and the occult. The idea of Catherine possessing a poison cabinet likely grew from the real cultural context of Renaissance Italy, where knowledge of medicine, herbs, and chemicals often blended uneasily with suspicion of sorcery and poison. The Medici, as patrons of science and learning, had access to the leading physicians and alchemists of their time, and Florence itself was a city where apothecaries mixed remedies that could heal as easily as they could harm. When Catherine arrived in France, she brought with her Italian advisors and specialists in arts that the French nobility did not fully understand. In a court already wary of her foreign origins, the presence of astrologers, perfumers, and alchemists gave fuel to rumors that she was dabbling in darker arts. One of the most persistent figures connected to Catherine was Cosimo Ruggieri, an Italian astrologer and supposed sorcerer who remained close to her throughout her reign. Ruggieri was said to cast horoscopes, read the stars, and perform rituals that guided Catherine's decisions in matters of war, diplomacy, and family. Chroniclers describe strange scenes in which Catherine consulted him about the fates of her children or the outcomes of battles. Some even claimed that Ruggieri could summon spirits or see the future through enchanted mirrors. These accounts painted Catherine as a queen who leaned not only on political advisors, but on mystical ones, a woman whose power was informed by forces beyond the natural world. Her association with astrology was not unusual for the time. Renaissance courts across Europe employed astrologers, and even monarchs, such as Elizabeth I of England, relied on figures like John Dee for guidance drawn from the stars. Yet Catherine's reliance on astrologers became uniquely infamous, partly because of her Italian heritage, and partly because of the crises that surrounded her reign. France during the mid-16th century was torn apart by religious wars between Catholics and Huguenots, and Catherine often found herself accused of plotting in secret, manipulating outcomes with hidden knowledge. The astrologers who stood beside her, men like Ruggieri and later Nostradamus, gave her critics an easy symbol to accuse her of witchcraft, heresy, and poison. The legend of the poisoned cabinet was tied to Catherine's reputation as a woman who outlived many of her rivals. Enemies who died suddenly were said to have been poisoned at her command, their deaths linked to mysterious powders or sweet confections laced with toxins. Catherine's connection to perfume and scent deepened these suspicions. She had introduced Italian perfumers to the French court, and fragrances became a signature of her style. To her contemporaries, the line between a vial of perfume and a vial of poison was frighteningly thin. Some whispered that her gloves, soaked in perfumes, might carry deadly substances absorbed through the skin, or that the elegant bottles in her chambers were not merely for beauty, but for death. One infamous story concerns the Château de Chaumont, where Catherine was said to keep her cabinet of poisons and secret laboratories. Visitors later recounted seeing hidden chambers, strange instruments, and locked chests filled with vials and powders. Historians have long debated whether these stories were based on reality or were inventions of her enemies, but the legend grew until Catherine was firmly associated with a secret storehouse of deadly tools. Her Italian advisors, skilled in apothecary arts, were accused of concocting subtle poisons that left no trace, allowing Catherine to eliminate enemies without open violence. Whether true or not, the suspicion alone gave her an aura of danger that worked both for and against her. The figure of Nostradamus added further to Catherine's image as a queen surrounded by mystics. Nostradamus, the French seer whose cryptic prophecies have fascinated readers for centuries, was invited to court by Catherine, who sought his guidance for the future of her children. She was particularly anxious about the fates of her sons, several of whom would ascend the throne during turbulent times. Nostradamus's predictions, couched in riddles, seemed to confirm Catherine's fears and ambitions. His presence at court was noted by contemporaries and linked her more deeply to the world of prophecy and hidden knowledge. To her supporters, consulting an astrologer was wise. To her enemies, it was proof that she trafficked in dangerous and forbidden arts. Catherine's reputation for poison also stemmed from specific incidents that appeared suspicious in hindsight. The death of her son-in-law, King Charles IX of France, was attributed by some to poison, though modern historians believe it was tuberculosis. The sudden collapse of rivals at court, the deaths of political enemies, and the mysterious illnesses that seemed to afflict those who crossed her path all fed into the myth. The religious wars of her time gave her Protestant enemies ample reason to paint her as a murderess, accusing her of orchestrating the same Bartholomew's Day massacre and of using poison to weaken opponents. Pamphlets spread across Europe, portraying her as a wicked Italian queen steeped in sorcery and death, and the poison cabinet became a perfect symbol of this dark narrative. Catherine herself did little to dispel these rumors, perhaps because they gave her a kind of power. Fear was a weapon as potent as any army, and if her enemies believed she held secret poisons at her command, they might think twice before challenging her directly. In a court where assassination and intrigue were daily risks, cultivating an image of mysterious strength may have been a deliberate strategy. Catherine, trained from childhood to survive in hostile environments, understood the value of being underestimated or feared. By allowing the stories of poison and astrology to flourish, she positioned herself as a figure both untouchable and inscrutable. The fascination with her supposed poison cabinet also reflects the anxieties of her age. The Renaissance was a period of discovery, experimentation, and blurred boundaries between science and magic. Alchemists pursued the secrets of matter, physicians experimented with remedies, and astrologers charted the heavens. For a queen to surround herself with such figures was not unusual, but in Catherine's case, her foreignness, her gender, and the turbulent politics of France made her an easy target. The myths grew not simply from her actions, but from the fears and prejudices of those around her, who saw in her a convenient scapegoat for every unexplained death and every ominous decision. Even centuries later, Catherine's name is tied to images of dark bottles, secret laboratories, and whispered consultations under the stars. The poison cabinet has become a metaphor for the suspicion that followed her, a symbol of the idea that her power was rooted not only in politics, but in hidden, deadly arts. Whether she truly kept such a cabinet, whether she ever ordered a rival poisoned, or whether she simply cultivated the image, the legend has outlived the reality. It has shaped her memory as the queen, who carried death in her perfume and destiny in the stars, a woman whose reign remains haunted by shadows of suspicion. Catherine de Medici's reign unfolded in an age when France was plagued by factional rivalries, bitter religious conflict, and conspiracies that struck at the very heart of the monarchy. From the moment she entered the French court as the wife of Henry VI, she was thrust into a world where every noble family schemed for advantage, where loyalty was thin and ambition endless. As queen and later queen mother, Catherine became both a player and a target in these struggles, her actions shaped by the necessity of survival in a kingdom that often seemed poised to tear itself apart from within. The Valois dynasty, to which her husband and sons belonged, ruled a fragile kingdom. Its claim to authority was challenged by powerful aristocratic families, whose wealth and military power often eclipsed that of the crown. Among these rivals, the Guise family stood out as the most formidable. Fiercely Catholic, militarily strong, and skilled at courtly intrigue, the Guises positioned themselves as defenders of the faith against the rise of Protestantism in France. Their dominance in the court of King Henry VI, particularly after their military victories, gave them influence that Catherine, as queen, could neither ignore nor counter directly. Her role was initially subdued, overshadowed by her husband's reliance on the Guise brothers, but she observed carefully, learning how alliances were built and broken, how favors were bought, and how conspiracies could be used as weapons as sharp as any sword. When Henry I died suddenly in 1559, after a jousting accident that left him mortally wounded, the kingdom was thrown into uncertainty. Catherine, now widow and regent for her young son Francis II, faced the reality that power in France was slipping from the Valois crown into the hands of the Guise family, who swiftly took control of the government. The Guises used their position as uncles to Mary, Queen of Scots, who was married to Francis II, to dominate policy and marginalize Catherine. She found herself queen mother in name, but sidelined in practice, surrounded by ambitious men who treated her as a foreigner and a woman without authority. Yet Catherine understood that power was not given but taken, and she began to maneuver quietly, looking for opportunities to reassert herself. The conspiracy of Amboise in 1560 marked one of the first great tests of Catherine's political survival. A group of Protestant nobles, alarmed by the Guise domination of the young king, plotted to kidnap Francis II and remove him from Guise control. The plot was discovered before it could succeed, and the conspirators were brutally suppressed, many executed in public as a warning. The Guises used the failed conspiracy to justify even harsher measures against the Huguenots, intensifying the divisions in France. Catherine, caught between the might of the Guises and the desperation of the Huguenots, began to recognize that her role would not be one of passivity. If she wished to preserve the throne for her children, she would need to play the factions against one another, using intrigue and manipulation as weapons equal to those of her rivals after the sudden death of Francis II in late 1560. Catherine's second son became king as Charles IX, still a child, which elevated Catherine to the position of regent in all but name. Now she had the chance to wield real power, and she seized it with determination. Her strategy was not to ally herself permanently with any single faction, but to balance them against each other, preventing any one group from becoming strong enough to dominate the monarchy. This earned her both admiration and hatred. To some, she was the clever mother who preserved the crown during chaos. To others, she was a schemer who encouraged instability for her own ends. Yet Catherine knew that France was fractured beyond repair along religious and political lines, and her task was to keep the monarchy afloat amidst the storm. The religious divisions of France during this period were perhaps the most dangerous source of conspiracy and bloodshed. Protestantism had taken root in many regions, attracting nobles, merchants, and intellectuals, while Catholicism remained the faith of the majority and the foundation of traditional power. The wars of religion that broke out in the 1560s were not merely theological disputes but struggles for political dominance, with noble families aligning themselves to faiths that suited their ambitions. Catherine's attempt to steer a middle course, promoting limited toleration for Protestants in the hope of peace, placed her in direct conflict with the Guises, who demanded uncompromising Catholic orthodoxy. This balancing act led to endless plots, betrayals, and bloodshed, with Catherine at the center. Accused of duplicity by both sides, one of the most infamous events of her regency was the massacre of Vassy in 1562, when the Duke of Guise's forces attacked a Protestant congregation, killing scores of worshippers. This atrocity sparked the first of the French wars of religion, plunging the kingdom into open conflict. Catherine, desperate to mediate, attempted to negotiate peace, but her efforts were undermined by the entrenched hostility of both camps. To Catholics, she seemed too lenient toward the Huguenots. To Protestants, she was suspected of plotting against them in secret. Every truce she arranged was temporary, every peace followed by renewed fighting. Her court became a stage where conspiracies brewed daily, nobles whispering of betrayal, generals plotting their next move, and ambassadors reporting that France was collapsing into chaos. Within this atmosphere, Catherine's reputation as a manipulator grew. She was accused of speaking one way to the Catholics and another to the Protestants, of promising concessions to both while giving nothing of substance. This duplicity, whether real or exaggerated, allowed her to keep the monarchy alive, but at the cost of deepening mistrust. Many of the conspiracies that haunted her reign stemmed from this mistrust. Protestant leaders whispered that Catherine was plotting their extermination, while Catholic zealots suspected her of secretly protecting heresy. In truth, Catherine sought not the triumph of one side, but the survival of her dynasty. Yet survival demanded the art of appearing to support, all while committing to none. The rivalry between the Guise family and the Bourbon family, who aligned themselves with the Protestant cause, became another source of constant upheaval. The Bourbons, led by figures such as Louis, Prince of Condé, challenged the Guises for influence at court, and Catherine often played mediator, shifting her favor depending on who threatened the monarchy most at a given moment. At times she supported Condé to weaken the Guises, at others she leaned on the Guises to keep the Protestants in check. This constant shifting earned her the nickname of a serpent queen, weaving in and out of alliances, never fully trusted, always suspected of betrayal. Conspiracies did not only involve noble factions, but also touched her own family. Catherine's children were both her strength and her vulnerability. She sought to secure their crowns, but their youth, inexperience, and at times frailty left them dependent on her guidance. Court factions sought to manipulate the young kings, driving wedges between mother and sons, and rumors spread that Catherine herself used poison or sorcery to control them. The rivalry between her third son, Henry of Anjou, and his brother Charles IX created further instability, with Catherine accused of favouring one over the other to maintain her dominance. The court became a theatre of jealousy, suspicion, and constant rumour, where assassination and betrayal were always a possibility as the wars of religion dragged on. Catherine's involvement in court conspiracies reached its most notorious moment with the events leading up to the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572. Catherine had arranged the marriage of her daughter, Margaret de Valois, to Henry of Navarre, a Protestant Bourbon, as a gesture of reconciliation between the two faiths. Yet the gathering of Protestant nobles in Paris for the wedding created tension, and soon an attempt on the life of Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, the Huguenot leader, escalated the crisis. Whether Catherine herself orchestrated the subsequent massacre, or whether she simply lost control of events, has been debated for centuries, but her enemies claimed that she had plotted to lure the Protestants into Paris only to destroy them. In the bloodbath that followed, thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered, and Catherine's name became forever linked to treachery and conspiracy. The massacre solidified Catherine's reputation as a queen of shadows, one who orchestrated deadly schemes behind the scenes. Pamphlets and propaganda across Europe painted her as the architect of massacre, the poisoner, the dark force manipulating her weak sons. Protestants depicted her as Jezebel, a woman who used deceit and violence to destroy the faithful. Even Catholic allies regarded her with suspicion, knowing that she shifted her loyalties whenever it suited her. The court itself became a place of whispered plots, where no one trusted her promises, where ambassadors reported back to their monarchs that Catherine de Medici was the most cunning player in France, and where nobles feared that, at any moment, they might be betrayed. Catherine's role in these bloody rivalries and conspiracies was born of necessity as much as choice. She did not inherit a peaceful kingdom. She presided over a France fractured by faith, divided by ambition, and riven by families who sought to eclipse the crown. In such a world, straightforward loyalty was impossible, and Catherine mastered instead the arts of manipulation, deception, and intrigue. She was accused of being at the centre of every plot because she was indeed at the centre of power, the one figure who remained constant as factions rose and fell, as kings died young, and as civil war consumed the land. To survive in such a court was itself a conspiracy, one Catherine carried out with remarkable endurance. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre stands as one of the most chilling and infamous episodes of the 16th century, an event that not only scarred France, but also cemented Catherine de Medici's reputation as the Dark Queen of Europe. To understand how such an explosion of violence occurred, one must trace the complex web of politics, religion, and mistrust that had been tightening around France for decades. By the 1570s, the kingdom was already bleeding from the wounds of repeated civil wars between Catholics and Protestants, known as Huguenots, wars that had torn apart families, ruined provinces, and drained the crown's resources. Catherine, caught between her role as mother to the king and as mediator among irreconcilable factions, believed she could forge a fragile peace through marriage. Yet what was meant as a gesture of reconciliation became the spark for one of the most infamous bloodbaths in European history. The plan was bold and risky. Catherine arranged the marriage of her daughter, Margaret de Valois, to Henry of Navarre, a Protestant prince from the Bourbon family who was destined to play a central role in France's future. The union was intended to symbolize harmony between Catholic and Protestant, a statement to Europe that France could rise above its divisions. The wedding in August 1572 drew nobles from across the kingdom, including many of the most prominent Huguenot leaders who travelled to Paris for the celebrations. For a brief moment, there was hope that this union could ease the tensions that had plagued the kingdom. But beneath the surface the city seethed with resentment. Paris was a deeply Catholic stronghold, and the presence of so many Protestant nobles was viewed with suspicion and hostility by the population and by powerful Catholic families like the Guise, who had no desire to see Protestant influence at court. The days leading up to the massacre were marked by a mix of festivity and foreboding. While the marriage was celebrated with pomp and spectacle, whispers spread of plots and betrayals. Catherine, ever anxious about her son King Charles IX's ability to rule, worried about the growing influence of Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, the Huguenot leader who had gained the young king's trust. Coligny's council threatened to pull France into a war against Spain, something Catherine feared would destabilize the fragile balance she had worked to maintain. Whether she merely feared his influence or actively sought his removal has been debated for centuries, but what is certain is that tensions escalated dramatically when Coligny was attacked in Paris shortly after the wedding. An assassin fired a shot at him, wounding him but failing to kill. Suspicion immediately fell on the Guise family, who had long viewed Coligny as their bitter enemy, but in the fevered atmosphere of Paris, rumours spread that the Queen Mother herself had sanctioned the attempt. The failed assassination created a crisis that no one could contain. Protestant nobles, enraged by the attack on their leader, demanded justice and threatened retaliation. Catherine and Charles EX, faced with the possibility of violent uprising from both sides, convened councils where desperate decisions were made. Fear gripped the court. Fear that the presence of so many Protestant nobles in Paris could ignite rebellion. Fear that Coligny's followers would avenge the attack with open violence. Fear that the fragile monarchy itself would be swept aside in the chaos. In this climate of suspicion and panic, the decision was made to eliminate the Protestant leaders gathered in Paris. Whether Catherine proposed it, consented reluctantly, or simply failed to stop it has never been definitively proven, but once the wheels were in motion there was no turning back. On the night of August 23, 1572, the bells of Saint Germain-l'Auxerrois rang out across Paris, signalling the beginning of the slaughter. Royal guards and Catholic partisans stormed the lodgings of Protestant leaders, dragging them from their beds and cutting them down in the streets. Admiral Coligny, still recovering from his wounds, was among the first victims, murdered and thrown from a window, his body mutilated by the mob. What began as a targeted assassination of Protestant leadership quickly spiraled into mass violence as the frenzy spread through the city. Parisian Catholics, inflamed by years of resentment and encouraged by the cries of vengeance, turned on the Huguenots with merciless brutality. Men, women, and children were hunted through the streets, houses were looted, corpses piled in gutters, and the Seine ran red with blood. The massacre did not end with Paris. News of the killings spread rapidly, and in towns across France similar outbreaks of violence erupted, as Catholics slaughtered Protestants in the name of faith and loyalty to the crown. Estimates of the dead vary widely, from several thousand to as many as 30,000, but the impact was not in numbers alone. It was in the terror, the betrayal, and the sense that the monarchy itself had sanctioned the annihilation of its subjects. The image of the French crown became forever associated with treachery, and Catherine, as the central figure at court, was blamed above all others. Pamphlets across Europe depicted her as a serpent, a Jezebel, a poisoner who had lured her enemies into a trap only to butcher them. Protestant writers painted her as the mastermind of genocide, a woman whose ambition and cruelty had no limits. The lasting shadow of the massacre was immense. In the immediate aftermath, Catherine and Charles EX tried to justify the killings as a necessary preemptive strike, claiming that a Protestant conspiracy had threatened the throne and that the crown had acted to protect itself. Yet few believed these explanations, and the massacre became a rallying cry for Protestants both inside and outside France. In England, Elizabeth I was horrified, her court filled with outrage at what was seen as a betrayal of faith and humanity. In the German states, Protestant princes used the massacre as proof that Catholic monarchies could never be trusted. The massacre deepened the divisions of Europe, turning the wars of religion into battles not only of faith, but of vengeance and fear for France itself. The massacre shattered any hope of reconciliation. The trust between Catholics and Protestants, already fragile, was obliterated. Every attempt Catherine made in the years that followed to negotiate peace was haunted by the memory of the bloodshed in Paris. Protestants could never forget the betrayal, and Catholics could never relinquish the sense of righteous triumph. The wars of religion resumed with greater ferocity, each side convinced that coexistence was impossible. Catherine's vision of herself as a mediator collapsed under the weight of her own association with the massacre, whether she had orchestrated it or merely failed to prevent it. She became the symbol of duplicity, the queen who smiled at peace while plotting death in secret, The massacre also cast a lasting shadow over her children and their reigns. Charles IX, haunted by the memory of the bloodbath, reportedly suffered nightmares and guilt that consumed him until his early death in 1574. His successor, Henry III, inherited a kingdom even more fractured, where his authority was constantly undermined by rival factions and religious hatred. Catherine remained a central figure in politics, but her ability to command trust was gone. Every negotiation, every proposal of tolerance, was met with suspicion. Her name was invoked as a warning, her reputation as a woman of blood overshadowing any attempts at statesmanship. Even when she sought genuine peace, her opponents believed only in her treachery beyond her lifetime. The massacre became one of the defining events in the memory of Europe. Historians, playwrights, and propagandists return to it again and again as the ultimate symbol of religious fanaticism, political betrayal, and royal cruelty. In Protestant lands, it was taught as a lesson in the dangers of Catholic tyranny. In Catholic lands, it was often downplayed or excused as a tragic necessity. For Catherine herself, it ensured that her legacy would never be that of a patroness of the arts or a mother of kings, but of a queen of blood, forever tied to the night when Paris drowned in its own violence. The shadow of St. Bartholomew's Day stretched far beyond the 16th century, shaping perceptions of monarchy, religion, and the very idea of female power in politics. The massacre was not simply an event, but a turning point, a moment when the fragile dream of unity shattered completely, and its echo reverberated across generations. For Catherine de Medici, it was the moment that defined her in the eyes of the world, the night when the line between political necessity and unforgivable atrocity disappeared, leaving only a legacy of suspicion, fear, and blood that would follow her name forever.